Welcome, everybody. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I'm co-director of the Center on the Future of War, and we're thrilled that you're joining us today for our speaker, Sam Moyn from Yale Law School. For those who aren't familiar with our center, I'll just give you a very brief overview. We are now in our 8th year. We're a partnership between Arizona State University, based in the School of Politics and Global Studies, and a DC-based think tank called New America. And we run programming both in Arizona and in DC and sometimes in other places. We run a major conference each year, the Future Security Forum. We run an online MA in global security, do a variety of research projects, and also, where possible, try to communicate to the broad audience with experts from within our center community, but then also folks we invite from outside. And we're particularly pleased to have Professor Sam Moyn here with us today. He's the Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law School and a professor of history at Yale University. He's the author of The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, Christian Human Rights, which was based on the Mellon Distinguished Lectures at the University of Pennsylvania. Also the author of Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World. And he's going to be speaking today about his newest book, which is called Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. Over the years, he's written for a number of publications, including the Boston Review, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Dissent, The Nation, The New Republic, and the New York Times, as well as the Wall Street Journal. A brief bit of housekeeping. We'll pass the floor to Professor Moyn in just a second. And then when it comes to Q&A time, please type your questions into the Zoom Q&A box, and I'll play the role of moderator so that we'll try to get everybody's questions in. And one final note is that today we're co-sponsoring this talk with the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. We're always thrilled to work with them. And the floor is yours, Professor Moyn, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And I'll talk for a few minutes about the book that I've recently published, and then get your thoughts. And looking forward to those in particular. So I'll share my screen. And hopefully some slides. So the book that I recently published in the fall is about the ethical and legal project of making warfare more humane. And maybe could start out with the moment that I kind of began thinking about writing it, which was in 2009, a kind of time of great enthusiasm in our country. Rather than depression about war and politics in general. It was the fall. Obama was announced as the newest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, and he was shocked like everyone. He came down from the White House residence, and the fall of 2009, he had a new dog to lighten the mood. He brought his 2 daughters, who were young then and whom he said were helping him keep it real. Though he was a global superstar now, he was just an ordinary person. And actually, he said he hadn't earned the Nobel Peace Prize yet. He hadn't done anything. Now, actually, in that first year, as we'll see, he'd done some very significant things. And then he asked, if he had to go pick up the Peace Prize, and they said he did if he wanted it. So he boarded a plane and went to Oslo in December 2009 and gave an absolutely extraordinary speech. I don't know how many of you will be, old enough to remember it. He started by saying that he couldn't affiliate exactly with someone he liked to think of as an ancestor. That's Martin Luther King Jr., who had won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 and had, protested the Vietnam War before he was assassinated. Obama said he was the head of the biggest military superpower in all of history. He couldn't be a pacifist. And he had a different interpretation of Christianity than King, which emphasized that there are always sinners and we may need to use force in this world. And yet he said there was a saving grace that America, unlike some purveyors of violence, fought war humanely. And here he provided a name check or a shout out to another Nobel Peace Prize winner, the very first, whose name was Henri Dunant, a Swiss gentleman who'd brought the world together, or at least the European states, in the 1860s and created the first Geneva Convention, which was intended not to end war, but to make it more humane by providing care to wounded soldiers. And Obama, for the first time really of any great political leader, including American political leader, said his legacy is important to me and for America as a great power in the world. Now, I mentioned that by this point, December 2009, in office almost a full year, Barack Obama had indeed done something. He'd invented the war on terror in a new form. And what I want to argue in this talk is that it was, in a way, as promised, a more humane form, but that's what's scary about it. And I think we need to take caution from that legacy. And if I'll try to bring us up to date with, Russia's Ukrainian intervention, and then we can chat about whether humane war is the problem or inhumane war, with all the violence that it so often involves. Obama promised his would be humane. Okay, well, I'm going to go back to the 19th century, since that's what Obama did, and talk about the beginnings of the laws of war, at least the aspiration to make them not a recipe for brutality, but for a more mild kind of violence, and then explain that he had some critics. Henri Dunant had some critics, and above all, Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist, who warned not to do it, not to make war humane. But his fears weren't really useful, I think, until our time, and I'll explain why that is. And then I'll close by coming back to Obama and the war on terror and Russia. So Tolstoy was a novelist. That's why we read him as a master of prose fiction, although in the end he became a kind of moralist and the most famous pacifist and vegetarian, really, of his time, and maybe all time. And it was in this context that he became skeptical of humane war. He basically argued that, I think in direct response to Dunant and the first Geneva Convention, that making war humane could facilitate it or make it easier to legitimate by those who wage it. And so there was a risk involved in making war humane. Now, I want to kind of reconstruct his argument and say that he's best understood as claiming that this is a contingent risk. Like it could happen that we could entrench the wars that we humanize, just as it could happen that if we try to make the death penalty more humane, it's harder to end. But we have to check in any particular case. Any war might be extended or entrenched through humanizing it. And if that's true, then it doesn't mean we shouldn't humanize it. We shouldn't try to make suffering less terrible in it, but we should control the risk that we take of entrenching the war itself. Now, Tolstoy made two interesting comparisons, not to the death penalty, but to chattel slavery and the slaughter of non-human animals. And he did this to kind of figure out how it could happen that this risk of what we can call humane entrenchment gets incurred. With the slavery comparison, he says, look in our past, because slavery was abolished in the 1860s when he was writing in the United States and serfdom in his own country of Russia at the same time, basically. And he says, people took the risk for a long time of making slavery more humane, because maybe they thought it was good and just it shouldn't be cruel, or maybe they thought they couldn't end it. It was too early or impossible to end it. And they tried to make it more humane and said, and this is true, like the big reform project among lawyers facing down slavery for a long time was passing laws to get slavers not to give up their slaves, but to treat them less cruelly. And Tolstoy's basic, argument is that the risk happens because the reformers, in a sense, collude with the slavers. And they say, we won't challenge your right to hold other people as private property in exchange for less cruelty in your ownership. And actually, it was a kind of interest convergence, because the worry was that slavery would be made, more invincible if it were humanized, less easy to challenge. And so it was actually in the slaver's interest to allow its humanization by reformers. And you can see that there's an analogy here that we could use to our practices of forming humanitarian groups that don't challenge wars, but they demand adherence to the Geneva Convention and other standards that are supposed to make war less cruel. They don't challenge the right of militaries and states to kill, but they say, do it more humanely. And again, that could serve the interests of the military or state. Now, Tolstoy's comparison to humane slaughter is somewhat different. That's the slaughter of non-human animals. And he says, look at how people think they're better when they are in the audience of violence in their name or for their sake, or they're the beneficiary of violence in their name or for their sake. And they allow the violence to go on and just kind of pat themselves on the back for demanding its humanization. And his example was a person who, eats a lot of meat, but insists that it's slaughtered humanely because that makes it okay. And where you could call the first problem we talked about with slavery, the advocate's compromise, you could call this the beneficiary's bad faith. And Tolstoy's concern was that just as we might kind of accept endless war on animals and think we're good people for eating them because we've demanded more humane techniques of killing, we might do so in war against people. That, a president might tell us that the wars that our states are fighting are necessary and just, and fortunately they're more humane now because they've been reformed in their methods and they're compliant with international law. So basically, Tolstoy is developing these two kinds of comparisons as an abolitionist, as we would now, call it in social justice terms, worrying that harm reduction poses risks that are sometimes incurred in humanizing violent corporal practices. And if they are, they have to be managed and controlled. Now, maybe Tolstoy was wrong. Dunant's successor, the head of the Red Cross for decades, named Gustave Moynier, thought so and said, no, it's the reverse. Making war more humane will make it less common. It will even, he says, you see at the bottom of the slide, end in the abolition of war. Well, that hasn't happened, obviously. And so the worry is that Tolstoy was right, and that we should care that when we make war more humane under law, we're incurring a risk that we might not control. Okay, well, I'll just very quickly explain like the historical part of this project, because these are all debates in the 19th century, very open, relative to debates in our time, when we don't really raise these edgy concerns about the apparently good thing of making war less brutal. Well, Tolstoy, was, let's say, too early, because the fact is that the laws of war, aside from that first Geneva Convention that Henri Dunant sponsored, the laws of war were not really committed to making war humane for a really long time. In fact, mostly, if we look at the history, the laws of war, as more and more treaties are made after 1864, even the Geneva Conventions of 1949, were really about kind of military privilege and making war, more brutal. The very, very, very limited checks in the texts of all the rest of the laws of war after 1864 on brutality. But that wasn't really the worst thing, because these early treaties didn't really apply to most global war. Most of the powerful countries were European empires fighting global war that wasn't constrained by international law, either because it was counterinsurgency within their empires rather than international war, or because it just wasn't seen to apply to so-called savages. So another way of putting this is to say there was a second track for war that was for racialized or religiously different enemies, and the laws just didn't apply and protect them. They were treated differently. No holds were barred. And then finally, even to the extent there were some early provisions for like less brutality in international law, they were basically set aside when push came to shove, as we saw in like the big world wars of the 20th century. Even amongst white Christians fighting white Christians, they were ignored in practice. So if that's all true, then there's nothing to worry about yet. There's no humanity in warfare, and therefore no risk of legitimation through humanization of war. As you see, some people like H.G. Wells worried that it was happening, but it didn't. So then things changed, and I argue that happened after the 1960s for lots of reasons. I'll just mention some. First, the world was decolonized, and all the states, all the peoples that had been subject to brutal European warfare for centuries, up to the point of genocide, had a voice in the content of international law, and they changed the laws of war, notably in these 1977 documents that are humbly called the Additional Protocols to the Geneva Conventions. And amazingly, that late, these are the first documents that say you can't shoot a civilian, that actually have a principle of what we call distinction between combatants and civilians, and says the latter are off limits. Further, they have a requirement that when you kill civilians collaterally, you can't kill too many, or in technical terms, you can't engage in a strike that's disproportionate to the military advantage anticipated. And that has a huge implication that the kinds of air war that dominated 20th century war, including American war in Japan and Korea and Vietnam, had to change. But then we get other forces. European states are done with empire, and so they're happy to be moral now that they're not fighting. And even in America, you find the emergence of humanitarian groups like Human Rights Watch that, on the ruins of earlier anti-war movements that had existed in America and across the Atlantic, resolve only to monitor the conduct of hostilities in war. That's like the reformer that Tolstoy worried about, that says nothing about slavery, only demands that it's more humanely practiced. And the military itself self-humanizes. after the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, the US military decides it has to take the laws of war seriously, and now they're humane in content. And military lawyers take on an extraordinary role. So the first Gulf War after the end of the Cold War in 1989 is simultaneously the first war that Human Rights Watch, the humanitarian organization, monitors for compliance with the newly humane laws of war, and the first war in which military lawyers help pick target. The United States complies with its international obligations. Okay, well, let's conclude by talking about the two wars on terror and how this, I think, comes how Tolstoy's worries become kind of credible in this new moral and legal environment. There were two wars on terror. The first involved George W. Bush, Obama's predecessor, invading two countries with lots of troops. Let's call that heavy footprint war. Over the years, a second form emerged. Let's call it light and no footprint war, that involves special forces, which are now being used in unprecedented numbers. You see that the last year of Obama's administration, they touched their feet to the ground in 70% of the countries, and that reached 80% under Donald Trump. And then, of course, there's the rise of the drone empire, which includes a vast infrastructure across sub-Saharan Africa, as you see, and Central Asia. And we could say a lot in terms of military history about the rise of this second form of the war on terror. What I want to claim is that one way it was distinct was its humanization, both rhetorical and real. That is to say, it was claimed to be less brutal and more compliant with the humane laws of war. And it actually changed the fighting so that it was at least a little bit more humane and a little bit more compliant. And then the risk is there, the very risk that Tolstoy was concerned about, that you'd get chronological expansion and temporal extension of war, even as it's made more humane. And that's been the really American history in our time. Barack Obama promised this in his Nobel speech. He says, "We are a standard bearer in the conduct of war." And amazingly, people in the audience, or the beneficiaries, at least some of them, some significant number of them whom he's speaking to in this kind of passage, take that seriously. And then we can ask, are they involved in the beneficiaries' bad faith of stopping asking so often whether these wars should exist and continue, and instead kind of consoling themselves with the fact that they've been promised to be more humane. A few years later, Barack Obama gave another absolutely amazing speech, his other major address about the war on terror, which was at the National Defense University in 2013. And this was a speech rolling out the rules that he demanded that targeted killings follow. Now, targeted killings had been viewed before the war on terror as a noxious practice under international law for a lot of different reasons. And our country normalized it in global history. And, it's very significant then that Obama, when it became known, and when there was the Obama administration itself kind of strategically brought it into the daylight, that he gave a whole speech about how it was humanely governed. Now, there was this amazing event, if you remember that speech. A peace activist named Medea Benjamin heckled him. And actually, she said, "Your drones aren't humane." She actually was making the humanitarian case, not arguing that they were illegal as such, or that the United States shouldn't be fighting war, even though she's a pacifist, part of Code Pink, the leader of it. And Obama responded by saying, off script, once she'd been expelled for heckling him, he said, maybe great nations shouldn't fight endless wars. Think of how they degrade themselves when they're constantly at war. But of course, the official purpose of this speech was to say, now in perpetuity, there will be rules for targeted killings outside areas of active hostilities. If we have to strike, we will make sure that we go beyond what the laws of war require. I mentioned before the rule of proportionality, which says you can only collaterally kill in proportion to the, or not out of proportion to the military advantage you expect. Obama's rule said, if you expect that you will kill or harm any civilian, the strike can't happen. Now, of course, we know that's a lie, given that a lot of civilians died under the drones and in targeted killings. But what's amazing is that he made the claim and that he understood that there was legitimation to be sought for war in humanizing it, claiming it that it will be humane, or actually making it a little bit more humane, which I think these innovations did. So if that's all true, Tolstoy had a case to reckon with. And it just turned out that we're the ones living in his syndrome, insofar as, a lot of American wars have been fought, continue to be fought, very unclear that they advance humanity. And yet, unlike all the American wars, indeed all the wars humanity has fought from thousands of years, these are wars that are humane in the way that Tolstoy worried would entrench and extend them. So what do we take from this? Well, I would argue that we need to return to the question which anti-war movements posed. What is the morality and legality of having wars in the first place? Now, amazingly, we've finally begun to ask that question first under Trump, because he was seen as so noxious that the wars he fought were questioned. And then above all, thanks to Vladimir Putin, who really in the last couple of weeks has reactivated concern with aggression that has not been mainstream since the end of the Second World War. Now, that doesn't mean we give up humanizing war. Maybe some wars are just unnecessary. Maybe there are going to be some unjust wars we can't stop. And in both cases, we should want wars to be more humane. But even then, there's a risk. And, sometimes we can stop wars either before they start or once they're going. And we want to make sure then that our zeal, our honorable zeal, not just our bad faith about making these wars more humane, doesn't distract us from the risk of that they'll just go on and on. So that's the main argument. I'll just close by reminding you of this irate rant that Vladimir Putin gave the other day, in justification of his intervention. And what does he say? Well, he says, America is violating international law all the time. It did so in 1999, when actually the NATO countries agreed they were violating the United Nations Charter and said it was a good thing because there were civilians to protect in Kosovo. And then, of course, there were other cases like the Iraq War, which were, I think, by broad consent, in blatant violation of the rules concerning the resort to force, the initiation of war. He also mentioned Libya and Syria, which are really interesting cases that we want to get into. Now, two wrongs don't make a right. That's what Mother said. And just because Putin reminds us that we may have fought humane wars, but often illegal in their initiation, that doesn't mean he can initiate illegal wars. It means the reverse, that we should have more control of force in our world, not just more concern for humanizing war. Now, we don't know. Maybe if there'd been none of this American illegality, it would have been more difficult for Putin to stage his own invasion. And just note, I'm not saying that Putin's war has been humanized in the way that American war has been, at least rhetorically and sometimes really, although it's only fair to note that it may be true that up until now, Putin is fighting this war differently than the Chechenian war and certainly the Syrian war, although that seems to be changing. Today, Putin Russia was expelled from the European human rights regime, and it's only fair to note that that's provided some humanization, or at least accountability after the fact for Putin's earlier wars, but that's not going to be true anymore. So we're living in an interesting world, I think. And I wrote this book originally concerned about American aggression, but I think now we have to say, if we're going to take aggression seriously, it can't just be that of our enemies. And, for all our proper concern about brutality in warfare, which has been kind of spiking in the last generation or two, we should also remember what a great American, Robert Jackson, who was a Supreme Court justice, said when he took leave to be prosecutor in Nuremberg. He said, if we condemn the Nazis as aggressors, but never open ourselves to the charge of aggression, we'll be passing our enemies a poison chalice. And I think the worry is that we may have done that, given the kind of, militarism of the last, 25 years. And Putin is evil in his own right, but may also help us see other evils that we're in better position to correct ourselves. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention, and
thanks so much, Sam. So thanks so much for that excellent presentation, and for the really exceptional book. So there are some questions here, so I want to go right to the questions from some of our audience members. First, from our colleague Thorne Wright, professor in political science. Is this potential trend towards more permanent, albeit more clean and humane forms of war fighting, primarily a phenomena of democratic major powers, getting a little bit to your point about Putin and Russia, as they are accountable to public opinion and the press when they commit abuses? As we've seen in the past few weeks with Russia's invasion into Ukraine, autocratic powers, when fighting wars, do not seem so inclined to try to prevent civilian casualties. Does this imply that over time that there might be fewer wars launched by autocratic states with more discrete starts and ends, but that those wars might end up being more severe?
I think it's certainly a possibility, because what I think the Tolstoy view implies is that states that fight humane wars may do so because the conditions for legitimating those wars at home differ, among more enlightened populations and ones that feel compassion for victims, but that those wars may be long running, lower level, let's say what Israelis call mowing the lawn. And Israel is a really important country in this story, if anyone wants to talk about it, because they obviously pioneered a kind of humanized occupation under international law and local law before America began its own, regime of targeted killing. So I think that part of the hypothesis is very credible, and it means that those states that take humanity more seriously. Now, of course, there's still tons of unaccountable violence and that liberal democratic states are committing, that those states might have a penchant to that distinctive form of forever war. Now, it's harder, I think, to say that the reverse, that autocratic states not having the same legitimation concerns will fight short wars. I didn't have time to go into this, but in the book I do, that Tolstoy's early view, which he attaches to a character in War and Peace called Prince Andrew, is that like brutal wars are better because they're less likely to break out or they're briefer when they come. And I think that seems empirically dubious. Maybe autocratic states have, with different conditions for legitimating wars, will do whatever they do. Short wars, long wars, little wars, big wars. And so I think there I'm a little bit less sure that this argument kind of will allow us to affirm that consequence.
Thanks so much. I want to pull two questions together here, both from colleagues from law school. From Michael Sachs, if Tolstoy is right, should Putin win the next Nobel Peace Prize? But linked to that, a question from David Cater: if not a pacifist, if not a pacifist, meaning some wars must be fought, why not conduct oneself humanely in that conflict? Consider the current violence in Ukraine. So related to the first question, ought the resistance to Russia lead to killing civilians on the other side?
So those are both really interesting questions. So on the first, I guess I'd say no. In fairness, this Prince Andrew character was cited in at the time mutually assured destruction was invented, and basically the argument there was that prospectively, if with nuclear weapons, if you fear the most brutal war ever, you just won't have it. And like maybe the threat of brutality then is the keystone of peace on that view. Now, that's not what Putin's doing. He's using conventional weapons inhumanely. I do think we need to take seriously that he has reawakened through his brazen, noxious act a concern about great power cross-border force that we did not take very seriously in our own states, more or less comparable illegality. Now, we could get into some points of distinction. Ukraine was a democracy, although under international law, you don't get to attack a despotism. That's, maybe we think there ought to be a difference under international law, but there isn't. Maybe we say Putin's out for conquest, like with the Crimea in 2014, and that's especially unholy. But then we say maybe he's out for a client state and regime change, which we've done several times. So no, I don't think he should win the Nobel Peace Prize, and I don't think we should thank him, but I think we should condemn him while recognizing that we remain hypocrites until we've constrained ourselves and not just the aggression of our enemies. Now, on the second question, again, this is an anti-war book insofar as every war America's fought in my lifetime has made the world worse. Can't find one that hasn't. And yet, hypothetically, if you can find me a just and necessary war, I think we should agitate for it to be made humane. And indeed, if all we can do in the face of an unjust and unnecessary war, like maybe the early war on terror, which maybe we couldn't easily bring to a halt, maybe Putin's war, then we should struggle to make it more humane. Again, this argument is modest. It's saying, be attentive to the risk of doing a good thing and incurring an evil consequence. And that's not going to happen every time. It will happen, could happen sometimes.
One issue that you brought up a number of different times that's somewhat addressed in the book, but maybe not as fully given particularly the situation with Ukraine now, is ways in which both in international law, but also in popular understanding, the validity of war has shifted during the time period that you researched. So war used to
Right.
be a standard practice of foreign policy. It was expected that powerful states would engage in wars of conquest and other types of wars as part of the ordinary manifestation of their power and their sovereignty. So at the same time as we've seen the rise of international humanitarian law, we've also seen a shift legally and morally in the idea that war is fundamentally both a bad thing and something that's only legal, at least to enter into war under very extraordinary circumstances. So I'm wondering if part of what's going on with the rise of humane war is an outgrowth, morally, socially, culturally, of this shift of war going from standard practice of powerful states to something that's widely viewed as illegitimate except under extreme circumstances.
So it's a great question, and I think it would require us, as scholars, to kind of get at first when you or we think that shift happened and why. So my own view is that it happens in part under the pressure of people, and I focus on women in the book who in transatlantic war are losing their brothers, husbands, and sons and are quite upset. But probably, it gets kind of that the norm against aggression and conquest gets institutionalized in the middle of the 20th century, not because of civilian harm or even the widespread death of soldiers in World War II, but because it's in the interests of states to have their territory and sacrosanct. And above all, after decolonization, the new states want their political independence safe from the return of empire. And so I personally think, let's call it the civilian revolution, and more generally, the kind of revolution that views war as horrible because of the kind of human cost, happens later in a second step. And there are debates about this. Many of us will know a famous book by Paul Fussell called The Great War in Modern Memory. And it's about how, there were these war poets who thought World War I was terrible for its human costs. But then there are debates that said, Fussell was actually projecting Vietnam and its cultural aftermath back into the past. And most people at the time of World War I were incredibly patriotic and didn't care that much, certainly about the other side suffering, but even their own, because what mattered for so long was the state and its success. So I guess I'm saying, in response to your question, there are big kind of historical problems to solve. And I personally would solve them in a way that would separate the achievement of a rule against war itself from the achievement of more concern and legal practices around the protection of human life, not just civilian, but soldiers.
Question here from Millie Feroz. The shock expressed in the media right now about the brutal tactics being deployed against Ukraine, a European country, suggests that the colonial exception to the laws of war is still very much present in our time. How and to what extent do you think that this logic operates in contemporary conflicts?
Yeah, I'm not saying that international law was ever deracialized. However, the war on terror was to a significant extent run by African Americans. And that just means something's changed. And I don't mean just Obama, but Colin Powell before him. And yet, of course, we know that there's a double standard. And if we compare, it's early days, but deaths in Ukraine, they're outrageous, but they're very low relative to deaths in wars we've fought and deaths that our country has caused, including hundreds of thousands just in Iraq, of hundreds of thousands of civilians. Now, that was over a longer period. And I'm not denying the brutality of this war. I think you might argue that that colonial exception has become less blatant. But when you see the outpouring of grief around Ukrainian refugees and compare it to the European response to the Syrian refugees, it's very hard not to conclude that you're better off today if you're Christian and white and a victim of war than something else. And we could talk about the laws of war and how they're in application by countries, especially great powers across racial and religious lines. It's not like there's no double standard. However, I want to insist that something's changed. And if we just think of global relations as unchanging domination and violence, we don't get very far, because, of course, there's a lot of that, but there are renovations. And one point of my book is to say that the kind of humane endless war is its own kind of evil that didn't exist in the past, and yet we've invented it. And so if we don't see that novelty and the way it's functioning in ways that weren't possible in the past, then we can't kind of reckon with, what we've done as distinct from what we've inherited from our ancestors. I hope that was responsive, but it was a great question.
Question from Julie Buffkin. Earlier today, when President Zelensky was appealing to the US Congress, he mentioned forming an association of countries that sounds like an alternative to NATO, of which Ukraine is not a member, and the UN, in which Russia is able to veto most things as a permanent Security Council member. Do you think this will be successful? Do you have any comments to share? Thanks.
Well, so I think there's a long-term perception that the United Nations is broken, and not least because great power war can't be restrained. And actually, I have a lot about that in the book, that there are these peace movements powered by women across the Atlantic in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And what they achieve is a transatlantic peace, while America, which had fought very little outside this hemisphere, with the exception of the Philippines, begins to fight global wars that remain brutal for a long time and then are humanized to an extent in our time. And what they achieved then was a great power peace that meant that some countries just can go to war without fear of censure by the UN Security Council, because they can veto it. And then there's like a long-term project of finding out how we can develop alternatives. Now, I personally favor like more participatory alternatives. There have been, for just as an example, proposals to have the General Assembly refer cases of aggressive war to the International Criminal Court, since right now only the Security Council can. There's also, of course, the project of providing parallels to the United Nations that would have that would exclude our enemies. That's a double-edged sword. It allows action, but it seems like it's opportunistic, and it kind of concedes that the United Nations itself can't be reformed. And we've seen that happen in sinister ways. Just as an example, when the new states after decolonization got much more powerful in the United Nations, the United States and its allies just created new fora outside the United Nations, like the G7 or like the World Trade Organization. And so I think we should recognize that, let's say, end runs around, institutions that aren't working very well can be not just good, but bad. In the meantime, of course, we should kind of explore ways of stopping the Ukraine war, of, figuring out how to indict aggressors like Putin, figure out how to bring to justice those who are ordering or committing war crimes. And if that takes alliances that are outside the UN, it's probably a good thing. My only concern would be hypocrisy, since, for all that, Americans have said we don't believe in torture anymore, for all that we've said we care about, the death of civilians under our drones and, in targeted killings, we've done zero about accountability for our infractions. And that includes, most obviously, aggressive war, in the targeted killings program, but also the inhumanity that we haven't managed to give up entirely, obviously. So, that gets into, complex questions. Does selective justice count as justice when, some countries can be brought to justice and others can't? And I guess, that's a debate I'd be interested in having collectively, rather than just, let's say, scapegoating Putin in a world of a lot of wars and a lot of death.
A question from Yugana Hafed. Any thoughts on the situation in Afghanistan and how the US just abandoned our allies? I lost 27 family members since August of last year.
Well, first of all, I'm so sorry. I myself supported the Afghan withdrawal for a few reasons. If you ask about the kind of the long-term trajectory of Afghanistan, there'd been mostly withdrawal long before last summer, and the Taliban, controlled long since a lot of the territory. And in rural areas, that's in part because a lot of studies are showing that that drones drove a lot of people into the arms of the Taliban. Furthermore, if we just look across the country at some of the vital statistics, the 20 years of occupation and war really, set Afghanistan back. And it didn't seem like something to permanently sustain. Now, that doesn't mean the way it was ended, and the way the aftermath has been pursued, including through sanctions, the transfer of humanitarian aid to 9/11 victim families, et cetera. Is it all defensible? That's my view. Now, I get that if in certain Afghan communities, you might say we were better off under the prior regime, in the cities the Taliban hadn't conquered, and it would have been better if America had backed that regime longer. But to me, that's totally honorable, as well as requiring us to ask about the whole situation, and what the best outcomes are. But clearly, we haven't found optimal outcomes under any of these possible choices, and that's, I think, one of the great tragedies of the last 25 years.
So you've mentioned a number of times drones as a focal point, comes up in your book a lot, and some references to shifts in military technology, precision weapons, robotics, AI. I'm wondering if you feel that these transformations, which are really only beginning to change what warfare means, and even as they proliferate, they still, the kind of more advanced versions remain in the hands of of a smaller group of powers. But do these technological shifts require a rethinking of the argument of your book, or a rethinking of just how to conceptualize war and how to regulate war, if at all?
Well, so my principal, response is that we drive technology, not the other way around in many cases. Technology has always affected warfare. It's just we used to ask for brutal weapons like napalm that were designed to inflict maximum harm on, not just soldiers, but, civilians. And then the conditions of legitimation changed, as I was saying before. And I assumed that those who are developing weapons, including not just drones, but the autonomous weapon systems with which I end the book, are responding to a moral incentive that, policymakers and publics want cleaner war. And that just says something that's new about us and can't be driven by technology because it's driving technology. Now, the appearance of these new forms means that war becomes very different. And, I closed the book asking about what is a utopia for some, that we could change war normatively into policing. That's to say that it's a permanent practice that's subjected to more humane standards. For example, that you, instead of killing soldiers anytime, in which is allowed in war, there might be a requirement to capture in preference to killing, as in policing. Or there might be a requirement from human rights law that you have to invite surrender before killing, which police have to do, and soldiers don't yet. And maybe, algorithmically, these capacities can be programmed into robot wars. And I think the strongest likelihood for the moment is that these new technologies will have a period of being incredibly brutal. Just like it took drones time to improve. And I think, we should, want to make them more humane while also fearing the logical outcome of that desire, which is, antiseptic domination, the way that policing functions in our world as mostly nonviolent domination of our fellow citizens, defined often by race. And so I think we have to care about different things. We have to care about violence, excessive violence, but also about domination, including nonviolent domination. And that technology, for me, raises those two concerns together.
So we have time for one question. I'll just bring two of them together from Sophia Tencio. You mentioned a track two approach to war during the 20th century in which rules for more humane warfare were ignored when facing a racially or religiously different enemy. Do you believe that there has been any significant shift in approaches to warfare with opinions on these types of enemies since that era? But related to this, to get to your point about Afghanistan, the major combat operations stopped quite a while ago before the pullout, and the on-the-ground war involved very few U.S. casualties, a combination of dominant U.S. air power, so not just drones, but other mechanisms, and a lot of Afghan forces, and then a lot of civilians caught in the fray, so that the highest civilian casualties occurred during the period of time of the lowest U.S. casualties. Why that's related to the other question is, to what degree are some aspects of all of this discussion of war have to do with who is bearing the suffering of conflict, and where does that leave us with this larger discussion of humane and the laws of war?
Okay, both great questions. So the first, I'm only claiming there's a relative and slight deracialization of international affairs. I don't think we should say nothing happened, but I don't think we should say that all peoples are as subject to war, especially great power war, as others. But at the same time, I think it's very significant that in the 1990s, the West went to war on behalf of Muslims. That's the Belgrade bombings around the Kosovo slaughter. And I already mentioned that African Americans played a leading role in directing the war on terror from the top. So it's not at all that there's race and religion aren't determinative and don't affect the application of law, but it's not just the same as when there were empires that killed people of different races and religion because no one cared in imperial metropoles. Indeed, they celebrated the fact that people who weren't white Christians just were subject to any treatment. And that's not true anymore. At least significant populations care about the way wars are fought, even against those who have different race and religion. Okay, second question. Absolutely. I mean, I said there was an intricate military history to tell about the transformation of the first to the second form of the war on terror, and that humanization is just a little piece of it, but much bigger as a piece of it is, among other things, the immunization of American soldiers achieved through that transformation. And you made some really good points about how that's really probably driving it. What I insist upon is that when Obama comes out and says, I'm fighting a drone war, he doesn't say it's for the sake of the absolute immunity of our soldiers. He says it's for the sake of care for our enemies and their civilian populations. And that's extraordinary.
So thank you so much, Sam. That was a great presentation. Thanks everybody for joining us today. It's really an honor to have you with us, and we very much look forward to seeing you at our next events. Have a good day.